Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I wanted to celebrate getting our first email suggestion for an episode. Usually I get all my suggestions through the Spotify Q&A or comments or the YouTube comments. So I was pretty surprised and pleasantly surprised to see an email come through with a suggestion. And we had an email from someone who wanted a follow-up to the episode on Black Mesa from Half-Life that we did ages ago. Seeing as there wasn't really anything in that episode about Half-Life 2, which they specifically wanted to hear about. So they suggested that I do an episode on the Combine, which I think is a great idea. So thank you for emailing in your suggestion. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to send in a request via email. I know that email is a little bit of a more involved process. It feels kind of dead these days, aside from marketing emails. So thank you. And I guess today we're diving back into the world of Half-Life. But before we get started, I just want to ask that you rate this podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening to it, or like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. The only way that I know that you're enjoying the content that I am making is if you let me know. So rate the show, leave a comment, or send an email to loretodeath@gmail.com to suggest an episode or just to say hi. And with all that shelling out of the way, let's just get on with today's episode. There are plenty of different places that we could start in this episode in trying to figure out the who, what, when, where, and why the Combine are what they are. But I think the best place to start is at the end of the previous episode about Black Mesa. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please go and do so. It's a direct predecessor to this episode, and it's got a lot of good information in there. So, like I said, we're going to start with Black Mesa, and in particular, the Black Mesa incident. The Black Mesa incident, also known as the Lambda incident, was the catastrophic event of the first Half-Life game in which Black Mesa scientists triggered a resonance cascade, which ruptured the space-time continuum, allowing extra-dimensional beings to create rifts that they used to invade Earth with. In the wake of this event, Earth was stretched to its limit trying to stop these extraterrestrial beings from taking over the planet. And just as they thought they were free from the threat of being overrun, just when they thought that they had won, there was, unfortunately, another force who was waiting in the shadows for their chance to strike. A vast interdimensional empire known as the Combine caught wind of the rifts caused by the Black Mesa incident and used them to launch an invasion. Humankind most likely thought they were in the clear after the Xenians were taken care of, and like I mentioned, their resources were stretched pretty thin already. So this invasion caught them off guard with their pants down, and they were not prepared in the slightest to fight against it. And this episode just absolutely kicks off here, and this started what would be known as the 7-Hour War. And yes, that unfortunately means what you think it means. Humanity in its fragile state lasted about 7 hours against the Combine. It's theorized that even if Earth had their full combined military strength, that they probably still would have lost to the Combine regardless. They might have lasted some days against the onslaught in this situation, putting up a good fight instead of whimpering out like a candle's flame against a monsoon. But this war was over far before it began. The Combine came in hot to Earth and started killing everything that moved, whether it be military or civilian. And the world's leaders knew that their time was going to come to a very swift end if they didn't find a way to stop this onslaught. There isn't an exact number of how many people died in these 7 hours, but we know that it was at the very least in the millions. It could have potentially been in the billions, but we can probably safely say that it was in the hundreds of millions who died in these 7 hours. But again, I am not entirely sure of that number. There isn't an established number of casualties. And so it was Dr. Wallace Breen, the former Black Mesa administrator, that discovered a way to communicate directly with the Combine. Like I said, the Combine just came in hot and started killing everyone. So they didn't give a time to retaliate. They did give a time to negotiate a peace before they started killing. So Dr. Breen opened that line of communication. And once that line of communication had been established, the United Nations gave Dr. Breen the green light to begin negotiations on everyone's behalf and try to mitigate the damages by any means necessary. Dr. Breen was able to negotiate a peace with the Combine by offering humanity's complete and unconditional surrender. They would meet any demands that were made in an effort to save what was left of the human race. In a double-edged sword act of mercy, the Combine agreed to their surrender and ended the 7-hour war. The humans were granted their lives but exchanged their freedoms for it. And Dr. Breen was given the position of interim administrator of Earth, which was largely just a ceremonial title to say that he was the one who was able to negotiate a surrender with the Combine. He didn't have any power in his administrative position, but was rather a puppet that just relayed information to the rest of humanity from their new overlords. He would relay information like this by what he called Breencasts, which was basically just a newscast where Dr. Breen would spout Combine propaganda at everyone through their TVs, radios, etc., in an effort to keep everyone kind of okay with being overtaken by a hostile race. This all happened so fast, as quoted by one Fern Barker in a newspaper clipping, it's possible that everything could turn out fine. And I love Fern's stern optimism, but they were sorely wrong. Nothing was fine. The humans that still lived were quickly gathered into reorganized city centers, while outside of these city centers, wildlife from other dimensions began making it their home. This made the areas outside the city centers extremely dangerous, especially for an ordinary citizen with no military training. And so people were advised not to make any rash decisions and go along with their imprisonment, lest they be killed by the Combine or sent out in the wilderness to be slaughtered by God knows what. These cities that humans were gathered into were nameless and relatively lifeless, having only numbers to identify them by. They turned into dystopian police states full of pro-Combine propaganda, which held up the theme of mass oppression. They're called cities, but they're more like mass prisons than anything else. These city centers were seemingly controlled by an immense building known as a citadel. I'm not sure if all cities are controlled by a citadel or if it's just the larger or more important ones that have a citadel, but it would seem and it would make sense that most cities probably have one. In the case of City 17, where the events of Half-Life 2 begin, the citadel there is the residence of Dr. Breen and the main headquarters for the Combine's Earth military operations. These citadels, like I said, are immense buildings that are situated right in the center of the city, which resembled a skyscraper. The sheer size of the citadel is likely another fear-mongering tactic. From any given point in the city, you should be able to look out and see the citadel on the horizon, acting as a very grim reminder of your new overlord's oppression. Not only did they span thousands of feet into the air, but went deep underground as well. Immense barely begins to cover the scale of these buildings. The one in City 17, and I'm going to reference City 17 a lot because that's really our only reference for these, was triangular in shape when viewed from above, so obviously tied to the Illuminati, and housed a giant dark fusion reactor at the top of it. This dark fusion reactor was associated with a portal that allowed the Combine forces on Earth to communicate with Combine forces in other dimensions, so having this reactor was fairly important. The building was also partially mechanized, meaning that entire sections could be changed on the fly to accommodate different needs. For instance, there's a setting that the Citadel can be put into when it's under threat. During this time, some of the outer plates shifted in a way that allowed for a larger opening so that troops, both air and ground, could move out in large numbers. This allowed for a greater fortification of defenses and was largely just another military tactic. Again, not to say that all citadels have the same setup, but I would imagine that they're all relatively similar. I don't see why they would be much different. It also seems like the walls that surround the citadel are also constantly pushing outwards, slowly but surely, destroying everything in their path, which would be slums and homes that people are living in. I'm not really sure if there's a reason for this. It seems like it's just kind of destroying things needlessly and pushing out from the citadel, pushing people further away towards the city limits. But it's entirely possible that as these buildings are being pushed away, they're also simultaneously being collected for scrap, and the resources are being used to maybe make other citadels or make other things. But I don't really know that for sure. As for the Combine, it seemed like they were made up of many different races, presumably those who they conquered and assimilated into their workforce. The Combine itself is quite the enigma, so there's very little known about how it started or what their overall goals were. It seems like the only thing that they had on their agenda was interdimensional domination. From what we know, it seems like the Combine visit different dimensions and find intelligent life that they can conquer and, like I said just now, assimilate into their workforce and military. So I would guess that maybe the reason that they came to Earth guns blazing without a single word was probably so that they could catch their prey unaware, as to make the most out of their initial attack, and then hope for a surrender. In the case of humanity's unconditional surrender, I think that this was the best case scenario for the Combine. Basically, no resistance and as much fodder for their war engine as they could possibly ask for. It seems like the next step in the Combine plan is removing the possibility of a revolution against the Combine. Being an entity that spans across potentially infinite dimensions, you can imagine it would be pretty hard to make sure that every indentured population was kept in control. And so they manufactured a peace so as to make sure that they didn't revolt. In the case of Earth, they did this by imposing a suppression field, which was there to enforce population control. As per the name, it would suppress human birth rate to 0 by prohibiting the formation of certain protein chains important to the process of embryonic development, as we learned from Dr. Kleiner. The effects of this are evident by the fact that when Gordon, our protagonist, arrives in City 17 2 decades after the Black Mesa incident, there are no children to be seen anywhere in the city. There's an interesting tidbit that Dr. Breen sends out in a communication to the people in one of his Breencasts, after receiving a letter from a concerned citizen about the suppression field, that he is assured it will be removed once the people prove that they no longer need it. He also states that the field is meant to simply suppress the urge to procreate, implying that it doesn't actually inhibit the process of procreation, which is contradicted in many ways, but we don't really need to get into that. Basically, Dr. Breen is just gaslighting everyone, and that's a very common theme. Another facet of controlling the population is the implication that the Combine had been putting something in the water to make people forget things, to make their memory unreliable, thus making them more pliable and likely to assimilate into the Combine's way of being. There's not a lot of information regarding that statement, but it would make sense that if you're going to attempt to exert total control over a population, that you would implement some form of sedation. There was also the promise of a better life under the Combine, which was spread through their massive propaganda machine. We hear in the train station plaza in City 17 that there are promises of immortality under Combine rule. Dr. Breen spreads this idea that if humanity cooperates with the Combine, that they will share their technology and vast knowledge to make humanity immortal through evolution. And that may not be untrue given what we know of the Synths. Technically, a Synth can live forever, as far as we know. Through maintenance and constant evolution, we don't know that the Synths can't live forever. And I feel like that's kind of the monkey's paw with the Combine offering. You hear immortality and you might think of a fountain of youth, but in reality, it just means that you're going to become a machine. And we'll get to the Synths in a minute. I realize that I haven't really gotten to that point yet, but we'll get there. And then the final portion of control over humans is the military, or more specifically, the Earth-based Combine Overwatch. The Combine took some humans that they deemed worthy and both physically and mentally augmented them through various surgeries to be more obedient, physically able, and resilient than your typical human in facilities like Nova Prospect. Those in the Combine Overwatch essentially turned against their own kind, enslaving their fellow humans. Whether or not they're conscious of the things they're doing is all for debate, I think, but I would imagine that through the Combine conditioning, they're all made a carbon copy of the same generic obedient soldier. Whoever they were before the Combine arrived was long gone, and all that remained was the Overwatch soldier. So I think they're conscious, but they're not the person who they were. They likely have no personality, and they are just the Combine. In addition to being primarily stationed on Earth, the Combine Overwatch were also made to be resilient enough to survive in other dimensions where the Combine have taken over. And as much as some people might long for interdimensional or interplanetary travel, being sent to another planet was seen as a punishment. There are various references in their dialogue to permanent off-world assignments, which are seen as a sort of probationary punishment, and no one seems to want to be tasked with heading to another planet. This is probably because other planets are likely to be inhospitable to humans, because remember, these Combine Overwatch soldiers are just human. They're stronger, but they are just people. So they can't just survive on other planets without their life support systems. And I doubt that the Combine is going to take special precautionary measures to make sure that their stay on another planet is going to be comfortable for them. There's also a branch of the Combine Overwatch that is dedicated to civil service, much like a police officer. These officers of civil protection, as they're called, are responsible for making sure that the general law is being enforced, and they do so with a pretty heavy hand. It wouldn't be strange to see an officer physically assaulting civilians or even executing them on occasion. Like I said, this is a dystopian police state. If you're caught not following the rules to a T, then you're basically opening yourself up to brutality. These harsh methods are likely used as a strict means of encouraging people to not break the rules. Because if someone broke your nose every time that you stepped outside out of curfew, you probably wouldn't do it more than once because you'd fear that it would be worse next time. Playing along with the rules is also incentivized by offering better living situations and more food to those who are loyal to the Combine. One of the reasons that someone might have decided to offer themselves to be one of these officers is that they would be paid handsomely in rations, and maybe upgraded to a suite where the floor isn't rotting out and they have an actual roof over their head. The only building that was kept up in any way, shape, or form in these cities was the Citadel. Everything else was left in a state of disarray, and there wasn't any incentive to make sure it was kept any other way. Because of the way things were, there weren't any farmers providing food to supermarkets, and people didn't have jobs. There weren't construction companies going around. But rather, the Combine was in charge of handing out food rations to people, which on their base level wasn't enough to get all the nutrients that you needed in a day. And I'm not really sure about this, but it doesn't really seem like people had jobs. It seems like their entire purpose was just to be livestock for the Combine. So it seems like people probably just waited around all day just to get their food rations to make sure they could get through to the next day. So the Combine uses this as another means of controlling the population by incentivizing good behavior with more rations and penalizing poor behavior by taking away rations. The icing on this dystopian cake in this whole situation is that surveillance isn't just limited to officers patrolling the streets. The Combine had a wide network of surveillance through city scanners, which are lightly armored flying security cameras, basically. These little nasties are equipped with a searchlight in addition to their camera, which was so bright that it could blind someone if they looked directly into it. It also doubled as a flash for their camera, which is recording all the time. If a scanner is damaged or witnesses a crime, it will emit a piercing alarm that will attract any officers in the area so that they can take preventative measures against the assailant. Anyone caught breaking the law, in addition to potentially having their rations taken away from them, are subject to plenty of different punishments. They could be merely beaten or killed, or they could be surgically altered and conscripted into the military. They could also be subjected to even more brutal mutilation, where they could lose most of their bodily function and forced to serve as slave drones. So, I don't know about you, but to me, death kind of seems like the best case scenario. So, to sum it up, after the invasion and surrender of Earth, the human race was rounded up and put into city centers. Of these people, some were chosen to be reconditioned as soldiers to make the Combine Overwatch, and everyone else was made infertile and potentially drugged to make them more subservient. Citizens of Earth no longer had any basic human rights, and any deviation from the Combine laws was punishable by death, at best, and prolonged suffering at worst. And this has happened to countless other races in the multiverse as well. And like I mentioned before, we don't have a ton of information about why this is happening, but I think we do get a little tidbit as to what the underlying reasoning might be through beings known as Synths, which I brought up before. A synth, which is short for synthetic, is easily described as a self-replicating robot that is able to evolve. They were created by the Combine and enslaved during their conquests and wars. Synths are anything from small bipedal creatures to flying scanning drones to large gunships and plenty of things in between. While they all take different forms, all of these synths are biomechanical beings, which means that they were created from the DNA of other aliens and fused with various mechanical parts. It seems like through the same methods that they make the members of the Combine Overwatch to be something greater than their human stock, the Combine have been taking various alien DNA and fusing them with robotic components to make their perfect war machines. So what does this mean for the Combine? Well, there's something unusual about all these synths that I noticed, and it's that they all follow the same aesthetics that make them distinctly synths. You could say that this is just a gameplay mechanic, or this is just a stylized choice to make sure that you can determine what is Combine and what is not, but hear me out. They all tend to have the same organic, sandy shades of skin with very few exceptions. They all have segmented limbs and compound eyes, and they all follow the same general aesthetic. I'm assuming that these synths are the product of countless other races that the Combine have enslaved over time, And you would think that that would make for some diversity amongst their synths, but they all follow the same basic structures. This makes me think that the Combine have some idea of perfection, and these synths are a direct product of that fascination. They seem to have this fixation on making everything in the multiverse conform to whatever they consider to be correct. Why else would they continually observe other dimensions, invade, enslave, and genetically modify other races? You could argue that these synths are just what they consider to be more efficient, or maybe synths are a byproduct of something from the original Combine race, and it's just something that they're used to and never really deviated from. But I do think it goes a little deeper than that. I definitely think that they have a fixation on making the multiverse a perfect organism, and likely consider themselves to be that perfect mold to cast everything in. Kind of a little bit of a crackpot theory, but I do think it makes sense, and again, just a theory, just my thoughts. After the Combine had dealt with the people and made them subservient to their cause, they began to strip Earth for its resources. I would assume that this was a pretty typical process on other planets as well, as it would make sense that they would need resources to commit other atrocities. And it seems like they do so with reckless abandon. And when I say strip Earth of its resources, it really does seem that they have no interest in the sustainability or repercussions of taking all of the resources that Earth has to offer. One instance can be seen where the Combine started draining Earth's lakes and oceans for its mineral-rich water, to the point where once sat a lush waterfront and pier set in empty and dilapidated desert, free of water and wildlife. But how exactly are they draining the Earth of its water? It's actually kind of hilarious to me, but they use teleporters. Basically, they put a teleporter at the bottom of a body of water and use it like a drain. There is another teleporter linked up on another Combine-controlled world, and the water that gets drained from Earth just goes straight there. It's like draining a bathtub, but on a comically huge scale. I would have to imagine that the stripping of resources is another way to cripple the native population and force some sort of dependency on them. If the Combine takes away all of Earth's resources, the people would have nothing left if the Combine were to leave. They would all die out relatively quickly with how damaged Earth has been left. So by doing this, they're essentially sterilizing Earth to make sure that nothing can live there without external help, thus creating a dependency on the Combine. That, and the Combine is basically able to use those areas outside of city centers as their own personal dumpsters. I mentioned before how there's not a lot of wildlife outside of city centers, and that's partly due to invasive species, like I mentioned before, like headcrabs floating around everywhere. But it's also because the landscape is just flooded with toxic waste. So with all that being said, you might be wondering, how would humanity even begin to get out of Combine control? And the answer is not very easily. There is a resistance, as we get to see in Half-Life 2, but in a world where you're constantly being surveyed and any threat to the Combine is swiftly dealt with, the resistance cannot have a central command center of any sort or any propaganda machine promoting the resistance. Having either of those things would almost certainly lead to the immediate snuffing out of any resistance movement. On top of that, most people aren't willing to take a chance on forming a proper resistance against the Combine. Eli Vance, a former Black Mesa researcher and physicist, is the closest thing that there is to a resistance leader. He's the one staging most of the attacks on the Combine that we know of, but even then, he's not a public figure of the resistance like Che Guevara or someone of that caliber. But despite the fact that they have to work in the shadows and can't be too organized without risking being discovered, the resistance was able to have a full military and research corps. A lot of what the resistance does is steal Combine technology, decipher it, and figure out how to use it against their creators. They also engage in espionage by planting members of the civil protection units to both assist civilians and attempt to keep the brainwashed Combine soldiers away from places like Dr. Kleiner's lab, which is integral to the resistance and could turn the whole operation up on its head if discovered. However, I feel like there's a lot to go over with the resistance, and I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because we're here to talk about the Combine. While the resistance is important to the Combine as a whole, there are plenty of members and operations happening under that umbrella that I could probably go on for an hour just talking about the resistance. But the point I wanted to make was that there were groups of humanity who were planning a kind of silent revolt. I'm sure that there aren't many sane people who fully supported the Combine, even Dr. Breen, their lapdog, who was probably just blatantly lying to save his own skin, hoping that someone else will get him out of this situation. Most people probably want out of their Combine enslavement, but don't know how to act against it, as that would likely just lead to death or worse. So I think most people are just kind of banking on the fact that there is a resistance. Most people probably don't even know about the resistance, but it's there. That's really humanity's only defense against the Combine. And that's pretty much what's happening to the people of Earth. We get a pretty good idea of what the Combine's goals and ambitions are, as well as an overview of their methodologies, just by seeing what they did to Earth. It really does seem like their goal is just mass genocide, and as much as I want to know more about their desires, we don't really know any more beyond what they did to Earth, and we can only really theorize. But we've only really been talking about Earth so far and how the Combine affected the planet, but that's because we don't really know much about the origins of the Combine. I tried to dig a little deeper and find out something about what the original race of the Combine was, and I came across a Reddit thread where someone was asking the same question that I was. We only ever see the Combine in the games as transhuman Combine military forces, or the Synths. So what was the original race? And someone brilliantly answered, why do you think they're called the Combine? And I just want to let that sink in for a second. Like, why do you think they're called the Combine? Because I think that is so fascinating, and it caused me to sort of think differently about the Combine and what the word actually means. And the word actually means 2 or 3 different things, depending on where you put the emphasis on the first or second syllable. Leave it to the English language to have the same spelling of a word to have multiple meanings. But we're not here to gripe on the English language. We could do that forever. The first meaning would be combine, with the emphasis on the second syllable, which is a synonym for merge, pretty much, which is to unite 2 or more things into one, like mixing sugar and flour, or even in a maths situation to combine something like fractions to simplify an equation. So that is combine. The second would be combine, which is how we're pronouncing this entity. And basically, it's a shortened version of the word combination, which is to unite 2 different entities. You'd mostly use this in a business sense, where merging 2 companies together would be a combine. The third meaning is a big old harvesting machine, an industrial combine. Something that you would use to harvest grains, which is really just combining the elements that you would want from a crop into one area, so that all crops in a field are merged into one place. Now, whoa. Hold up a minute. You used the word merge in all of those, so don't all 3 of those examples mean the same thing? And I'm so glad you asked that, because the answer is yes. They're all effectively the same thing, except for the tractor. You really have to stretch it a bit to make farm equipment work, but it still technically does work under that definition. And it was named Combine for a reason. So if you want to argue semantics with someone, then take it up with the farmers, not me. The difference between the different pronunciations are actually just the difference between verb and noun. To combine something is the act of merging entities together as a verb, and a combine is a noun. So I guess to create a cake, you have to combine ingredients into a combine. So a cake is just a combine, and I think I'm just going to call all cakes and pastries combines from now on. But why does any of this matter, and how does it relate to the Combine? It seems like you're just stretching to make this episode longer, and you might be right, but it's just the frame of mind that I was put on once I read that answer on Reddit. Why do you think they're called the Combine? And it's because they're a combination of multiple different races and beings that form one large combine. This isn't exactly a revolutionary thought. I'm not going to pretend that this is something new, but it's something that's very interesting to me because I didn't really think of it for what the word is. And sometimes when an organization is called one thing and it's just an ordinary word, it kind of loses its meaning, and you don't think of it as that word. Even if you use that word in your everyday life, when you're thinking of it as an organization, it's not that word. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how my brain works. So having that question asked, why do you think they're called the Combine, really just like turned my brain. It turned on a switch. And it's almost like a light came on and I'm like, oh. So I don't think that the Combine exists as just one entity that we can trace the roots of. So the answer to my question that I asked, what's the original race of the Combine, is that there likely isn't one race that this all started from. Or rather, there might have been one race, but it's so far removed from what the Combine are now that one race isn't necessarily responsible for it. And that the leaders of the Combine probably all aren't one race. So the existence of the Combine can only have existed once they were already composed of multiple races. So hear me out. If I had to guess, I would say that there was one race who initially figured out interdimensional travel. I think there are two scenarios, and I'm going to kind of go through them both at the same time. I think this group of beings would likely have been under some sort of tyrannical dictatorship, which caused them to seek out other dimensions to take over. Or perhaps they were a doomed race who stripped their planet of resources and was simply seeking an alternative home or somewhere that they could funnel resources from. So one is just neutral evil, and the other one is lawful evil, I guess. They're both pretty bad. These beings discovered interdimensional travel, much like humans did, and used that as a means to an end. Whether the initial goal was to perform a hostile takeover of another race, or they were just looking for a new home, the end result would have been the same. In either case, they would have found an intelligent race who had a planet full of resources that they could exploit. In the case of the latter, they might have stumbled upon this planet and were met with hostility and had to perform a hostile takeover in order to get that planet's resources. Maybe they started mining somewhere and didn't realize that the planet was inhabited. But for both situations, the race that they encountered was either wiped out or enslaved. And the cycle repeated itself once the new planet was bled dry. And eventually, over enough time, again, both situations lead to the exact same place. They became a combination of different races, and the ones in power decided to found the Combine, and they probably named it after its subjects, which were Combines. They were combinations of other races. And those combinations would have likely been what we see as the Synths, or the synthetic beings. Because we know that those are the combination of multiple aliens' DNA fused with biomechanical parts. So that would kind of make sense to me. I don't know if that's too in the weeds. I don't know if that's too out there, but that's kind of how I would see it anyways. But that's all speculation, of course. There's no way that we would know unless we got Half-Life 3 and decided to take the fight to the Combine directly in that story. My point is that there's no one race that controls the Combine. My best guess is that they're probably all synthetic, created out of a soup of other beings who have forcefully evolved themselves into thinking that they're better than any other race, and they want to make sure that everything in the multiverse is converted to their vision of perfection. And I know that kind of went into the weeds a little bit, but it is a fun thought experiment, and considering that we don't actually know anything about the origins of the Combine, it's kind of fun to speculate about what they might have been and create some sort of fan fiction. As much as I don't really like to speculate a ton on this podcast, I try to stick to the facts, but I feel like it's kind of worth it in this case where we don't know a ton. And the last thing that I can really talk about without getting too much more into hypothetical nonsense is talking about their technology. And I couldn't really find a good segue into this anywhere. So we're just going to leave it here, drop it on the ground, look at it. And suffice it to say that humanity never really got a grip on exactly how their technology worked the way it did, but they did have some ideas and there were some common ground. We know that their society was largely powered by dark energy, which we addressed before with City 17's Citadels, dark energy core, and fusion reactor. Theoretically, it's the most abundant source of energy that there is, so why wouldn't they use it to power everything from their teleportation devices and buildings to their vehicles and weapons? And we can really start at any of those options, but I think that teleportation is the one to start from. So we know that the Combine can teleport through dimensions, and they use teleportation so liberally that they were able to set up teleportation devices at the bottom of lakes to drain them of their water and transfer it to other dimensions. However, despite their liberal use of the technology, it has its limits. And the main limit being that they can't really teleport locally, or at least not consistently. It seems that teleporting within one's own dimension is actually much harder than it seems. When humans first discovered teleportation, they ended up finding the Zen dimension rather than finding somewhere on the other side of our own planet. And I think that's because it's somehow easier to find a place like Zen and use it as a sort of dimensional slingshot to get to another dimension, which is exactly what the Resistance ended up doing. The Combine managed to find a way to get past the layover in Zen and instead just went on one direct flight to their destination. But again, it only ever worked really between dimensions, not locally. So on Earth, the Combine had to rely on mechanical forms of transportation like their own synth carriers or previous man-made systems like trains. That's why we still have the train stations and there aren't just teleporters everywhere. However, it seems like the form of teleportation that mankind ended up creating was different from that than the type of the Combine used. It turns out that the way that humans did it was actually much better at achieving local teleportation, and it might have just been a fluke that their first foray into teleportation ended up being a connection to Zen instead of somewhere on their own planet. But the Combine made it their mission on Earth to find out as much as they could about the teleportation devices that mankind had come up with, and used Eli Vance as a means to attempt to learn more about it. Maybe this is why they decided to spare humanity instead of eliminate them en masse, because if they just killed them all, they would never get an opportunity to learn more about what they had discovered, as local teleportation would be a huge asset to the Combine. But like I said, they also power some weapons and vehicles with dark energy. We know this from the Combine Pulse Rifle, which is basically just their equivalent of a standard human assault rifle. The main difference being that it doesn't shoot bullets, but it rather uses dark energy to create condensed energy, which it shoots at the target, potentially disintegrating them on contact. Less obscure would be the vehicles, which would likely harness dark energy in order to power them. I would imagine that they don't need as much power to get a synth going, like a gunship, because it's biomechanical. These synths would likely have their own innate bioenergy, keeping them going, while the dark matter was likely used as a fuel to keep them going for longer and power all of the mechanical portions of the ship. But that might just be me talking ever so slightly out of my ass because I don't have a ton of information about the inner workings of the synths. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic of the Combine. There's not really much else to say unless I go over the entire events of Half-Life 2, which I definitely could go over, but I feel like this is a good enough overview of the Combine. This is kind of the Combine without talking too much about the game itself or recapping the game itself. I know that last episode on Black Mesa, I kind of did go through the entire events of Half-Life 1, but that's because you can't really talk about Black Mesa without doing that. I feel like we can talk about the Combine without just going over the events of Half-Life 2. So that's kind of why I went down a rabbit hole in this last little bit. So I suppose that brings me to the portion of the episode where I ask, what did you think? What are your theories on the Combine? What do you think their goals are? Do you think that their goal is just a flat-out genocide, or do you think they're trying to build to something bigger? You can find us online at Lord's Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so if you head over there and hit subscribe, I would really appreciate it. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me or at lorddeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, there's a comment section attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. If you're on YouTube, you know what to do. Leave a comment. I would love to hear from you. And remember, if we ever get visited by aliens and they immediately come in like Frank and start blasting, you're probably best trying to get caught in that initial crossfire, because I don't think that there's many good outcomes of finding a peace with a bunch of interdimensional or intergalactic beings who decided that the best way to say hello is to start a genocide. I guess the main point of this episode is that genocides aren't cool. Don't do them. Don't do a genocide. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.